It's just fantastic. Captain's log, subdate 210301.2. We at the ISO Cubes recently hired an expert to see if they can break out of the ISO Cubes. What they don't know is that if they are successful, we'll slap them with prison break charges and put them back in an ISO Cube and implement the changes needed to keep them there longer. And we'll keep doing this until they die. Welcome everyone to the Halls of Injustice. Today we have inmate number 062, Zoaib Hussain, who I'm torn as to whether to call Mr. Hussain, inmate 062, or Zoe, because I can't be bothered to learn to pronounce his name correctly. If I use any of those names throughout this video, let's just assume I made my mind up on one of, if not all, of the above. Inmate 062 has an affinity for intimacy. He craves it like a vampire does blood, and a chocoholic, well, that one's fairly self-explanatory. He seeks his intimacy and will do whatever he has to do to get it, because that's where he gets his kick. Not from getting it, but the chase. He loves the chase. This can of course be seen as a positive trait, provided it doesn't go too far. Inmate 062 was an economics student at King's College London, he himself being from London. I would assume the reason he stopped was because of his incarceration, although it is equally likely he dropped out because he sucked at economics. For the sake of it, that part can remain a mystery because nobody in this video series cares. This ISO Cube is for you, and for good reason. You're a special kind of obsessive person, aren't you, Mr. Hussain? Sorry, inmate 062. In 2017, inmate 062 started messaging a young lady, who we shall call for the sake of this video, Jane Doe. She has retained her anonymity, and I will of course, as a judge, respect that. Inmate 062 was very much interested in this lady. Very interested in this lady. This lady, Jane Doe, was not as interested in the attention, and took necessary steps to cease communication with inmate 062. Inmate 062 reacted to this by taking it like a pro. Insert my sarcasm sign wherever necessary. So thus began 3.5 years of, air quotes, courtship, all of which in inmate 062's mind. Inmate 062 would then proceed to send more messages to Jane Doe. Understandably, she rejected them. So inmate 062 upped the ante by sending roses. He sent over 100 at one point. Again, Jane Doe rejected inmate 062's advances. So inmate 062 decided to create multiple accounts on social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter being the more notable. And with these fake accounts, he would send highly inappropriate messages. Again, his gallant attempts were rebuffed. So he proceeded to continue sending gifts. These gifts would include quite expensive handbags. I'm sure they came in handy later to smack him with. For the sake of it, he was yet again rejected. For 3.5 years, he dedicated his time, his effort, his resources to this woman who had no interest in him. At some point along the way, he lost all sense and became so obsessed over her, putting her on a pedestal that even when she said no, he wanted it anyway, which speaks volumes about his integrity, that he took the rejection and thought no in his mind meant yes. If it isn't apparent enough with the time frame we are working with, inmate 062 clearly would not stop, and when a window of opportunity opened, he took it, on a train from London to Swansea, and walked right up to her house and knocked on the door, which is where those handbags might have come in handy. The house he knocked on was her home, her family home. Her family were not best impressed when alerted to who he was, although they knew already, so they detained him. Interestingly though, 2 days earlier from this, he had in fact been slapped with a restraining order, an indefinite one, because he was getting a bit much. All the sexual comments on all the platforms and fake accounts, the gifts, it was a bit much, and I can certainly understand why Jane Doe had had enough. Inmate 062 was psychologically evaluated, and they did notice he had incredibly obsessive and delusional tendencies. Who would have believed it? Thank you, by the way, to the psychologist who managed to state the bloody obvious. At some point, I'm going to make an IsoCube wing just for psychologists. You all know why. Take the sarcasm, and let's get back into this. In March of 2020, inmate 062 was sentenced to 58 weeks in prison, half of which was supposed to be served in prison, the other half on remand. The restraining order that was already in place was still in effect, but inmate 062 was paroled on May 15th, 2020. He had barely served 8 weeks of a 58-week stint, so he must have done something to impress those behind bars, or space was required. Or maybe he was considered high risk, courtesy of Corona-chan. Personally, I don't care why he was paroled. My interest is in the fact that he was paroled. He should remain in the IsoCubes until his sentence is complete. We don't do half sentences here, even for good behavior. But since inmate 062, Mr. Hussain at that point, was paroled, he was free. He could possibly go back to college after sheeple crowd control ended, which it hasn't. Perhaps he could get his life back on track like he said he would do. 2 days later, he'd already started sending her messages again, on more fake accounts. Interestingly, Jane Doe did not know that he had been released early until those messages resumed. So inmate 062 was arrested again and charged with breaching his restraining order, which carries a far heftier sentence. During this trial, inmate 062 maintained he was innocent, not just for breaching the restraining order, but also of all the matters that he had previously pled guilty to, because he believed he was in a relationship with her, and that he also wants to put this matter behind him and move on, which is one of the biggest loads of bollocks I've heard in quite some time. So even after hearing a victim impact statement where you could see him smirking while hearing the tale of the 4 years at that point that she had endured, all the hell, Jane Doe that is, had endured at the hands of a rather obsessive stalker who, the moment he got released from prison, carried on, inmate 062 got a very different sentence. 2.5 years. Half of that is to be served in prison. My view, obviously, the whole sentence. The rest is on remand, or license. And the restraining order becomes an indefinite restraining order. As far as sentences go, it's not the strongest. And as it had been stated by the same psychiatric evaluation that he had pre-sentence, shown no remorse for his actions, I'm quite happy for him to stay there. So get in your cell for the next 2.5 years, inmate 062, aka Zoe. It's going to be quite cold. We don't do heating here. As we're done, I'd like to know what you think about inmate 062. So please do let me know in the comments down below. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and thank you all very much for listening.